as promised, we're joined by Dr. Thor Stein, Associate Director of Neuropathology Core of the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease Center. Doctor, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. We've discussed a little bit before we got going. I'm familiar, and as you know, I donated my brain to the Legacy Foundation as far as for study later on of my brain as it relates to CTE. Lost a teammate on Monday, Dwight Clark, to ALS. And, I was really curious in talking briefly with Chris Nowinski this week, what the connection was. And I figured somebody like you would be the perfect person to talk to about the possible connection between the two diseases and or where things are right now as far as that CTE situation goes.
We're unfortunately seeing more of these cases. I mean, it's been known for a while that former national football players are at increased risk of ALS.
Mm-hmm.
four times increased risk over the general population, and we're really starting to see that in connection with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And so, as part of our the brain bank through the Boston VA, BU, and Concussion Legacy Foundation, we've got a number of cases, and ALS is really one of the more frequent diseases that we find that occurs alongside CTE. Unfortunately, we really are at the beginning of trying to understand this. We have known for a number of years now that there is a connection, that former national football players are at increased risk of developing ALS, or motor neuron disease, by about fourfold over the general population. And we've certainly seen more cases as we try to study this post-mortem or after death, when we look at former athletes who have chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, and we find that ALS is one of the more common diseases that occurs along with CTE. So there's certainly a link there, and I think we're just still trying to understand what the mechanisms might be behind that.
For those that may be a little unfamiliar subject-wise with CTE, wasn't that out of the Boston U study about the sort of multiple hits to the head that don't have to be concussions, having as much to do with developing these kind of diseases as it does? People figure out you got to be like a boxer KO'd, getting a 10 count to qualify as a concussion, but the repetitive head injuries or repetitive head blows can be just as bad, can't they?
Yeah, that's right. Concussion is kind of a subjective thing. Some people may experience symptoms or describe symptoms, and others may not, despite having an injury to the head. And so we try to look at that association, and but we found that 16% of individuals who have donated their brain and have CTE deny ever having a concussion. And so these are, linemen, these are, people who are really in the thick of things, and certainly they've been knocked around, but they claim they haven't had those symptoms. And so it's really, what we find is it's the years of play. So the more years you've played, the higher level you played, the more likely you are to develop this disease and to have this type of injury to your brain.
Yeah, I was interested when I first started studying this some while back, the definition of a traumatic brain injury or even a mild traumatic brain injury, and that it included loss of consciousness up to a pretty good length of time. Mild to me had a whole different term when it came to TBI. I personally got knocked out 3 separate times, once on each level I played, once in high school, once in college, once on the professional level. But by I think a common sense maybe definition of concussion, in 21 years of football, as we used to refer to it, when you get your bell rung, doesn't that qualify as a concussion?
That's right. Yeah, and I think the definition has kind of changed over time. I think in the past, right, what would be considered a mild traumatic brain injury would be exactly as you described, something where you're out cold for 30 minutes or more. It's not, and so that's actually probably a pretty serious injury. But nowadays we try to recognize that there is injury that occurs to the brain. It doesn't necessarily result in that severe of a neurological injury. And so really the current definition is any change in your thinking or any change in your perception that occurs after an injury. So seeing stars, tunnel vision, feeling a little dizzy, all of those things are a concussion.
Yeah, yeah. Echo chamber, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting subject to me, obviously, besides the fact that I played as long as I did. It's also, and it's something that's got to be extremely intriguing to somebody that's involved in the neuropathology, the study of the brain in general, the capricious nature of how these things develop, how one person that plays 21 years may not have any real signs at a certain age, where some people that played half a year of NFL, maybe never played in the NFL, maybe just played high school football, 30 years later, they're showing some pretty significant signs of things like this that, there is no one sort of key that tells you, okay, this is what happens. Of course, that's why you guys are all working so hard at studying it.
Right, and that's what makes it so difficult to study. You're absolutely right. There's so much difference just between people's experiences, and so we're trying to kind of sort that out. And in order to do that, we really need to study a lot of people. And so we're getting some sense that there are probably genetic factors that influence. So genes they're not gonna determine whether you get it or not, but they may determine how severe the disease is. And so there's a lot of different things at play that we have to kind of sort out. And then of course, as you age, you're at an increased risk for not only developing CTE, but also a host of other degenerative diseases. So Alzheimer's pathology is very, very common as you get older, and so that there's a lot of comorbidity or all different types of diseases that kind of play a role in how you might present clinically, or how your thinking might decline.
Is it not safe to say, but is it at least accurate to say that there are several of these diseases that are kind of in a family, whether it's ALS and CTE and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and whatnot, that obviously they affect the brain, but they're all in the same general area?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could refer to them all as degenerative diseases. So they're all diseases that slowly progress over time and that slowly lead to death of different types of cells, and there are different pathologies that are involved, but they all kind of slowly lead to decline in function of the brain.
When you look at news as it relates to CTE specifically, you're obviously right there at the cutting edge of a lot of the study being done. And as an outsider sort of looking in, we're subjected to the news cycle and the kind of news we get. And when you see stories out there about saliva tests being touted, that they're going to be able to identify, the proteins after a traumatic brain injury, or any other of several types of things that have been in the news over the course of the last year or so, as someone is tightly associated with the study as you are, what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, science is like anything else. It's messy, and we're at really the infancy of understanding this disease. And so there are studies that come out that are just in maybe a few people, that are looking at changes that are very, very subtle and small amounts. And so they they suggest that, hey, maybe this is something that is going to be important and interesting, but they don't, almost 9 times out of 10, some of these early studies, especially in really small numbers of people, are going to fail later on when you look at larger numbers and you understand all of the complexities that are involved. And so I think because there's such, CTE, I think, is a little bit unique in that there's such a media interest. The public really wants to know, right? This is really important for people who are playing sports or whose kids might be playing sports, and so they're really on top of all the research. And so I think what we kind of see is that some of these early studies that are really designed more to say, hey, this is something we should look at and we need to study more. They kind of get interpreted as this is a test that is now ready to go, and that's just not the case. And so I think it's kind of difficult to walk that line in terms of not hyping small steps too much, but still trying to push the field forward and try these new things that may or may not work.
Doctor, if I'm a parent or a grandparent, whatever, and have kids that want to be involved in sports, any sport, because there are several out there that can have implications when it comes to repetitive blows to the head. Where's the best resource for people to go where they can actually get accurate information about this issue so they can make what I always refer to as the most important thing about this type of a deal is making an informed decision? How can those parents make an informed decision about what their kids should or shouldn't do when it comes to sports?
Yeah, that's tough because I think that an informed decision is we're still trying to work it out. And so we don't have all the answers to all these things, even things like football and boxing. There's some question, can these be done safely? And so I think that the Concussion Legacy Foundation has really done some important work in trying to get that information out and try to educate people. And so that's a resource that people, I think, should refer to. And otherwise, just really staying on top of what kinds of things are coming out. But it's going to be a slow process, and I think to some extent using some common sense. If you have a kid who's playing a sport and he's getting concussions or having repeated injuries, I mean, you need to think about whether there's another sport that might be a little bit safer for that individual. So it's a tough and very important question that we still are trying to wrestle with, I think, as a society.
Is it safe to say the later you start those kind of sports, the better?
It does seem to look that way. So a number of studies have come out now suggesting that playing these contact sports at full speed at a young age, really before age 12, which is when a lot of the neurodevelopment is still happening, is probably not good and probably detrimental to your brain health later on in life. So I think that is some of the kind of interesting work that's coming out of this, because we've, especially as a society, have moved more and more towards starting earlier and earlier. And maybe that's not such a good thing, at least in terms of these sports where, kids can kind of get knocked around.
All right. Hey, Doctor, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. You've helped make me and hopefully people that watch this podcast a whole lot smarter.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.